Well, good day. I am the Marginal Non-hermit, and I'm here today to talk about a book recommendation. This is a book that I think everyone with love of liberty should read and understand and grapple with. And the book is The Gulag Archipelago by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, which was written between 1958 and 1968, but discusses events as early as World War II, and with some historical perspective to stuff even earlier than that. So, why should you read The Gulag Archipelago? First off, it's an in-depth portrait of life under a totalitarian system. The world that people lived in Soviet Russia was one of the most oppressive, mentally oppressive regimes of all time. It had a great deal of power and a great deal of reach. And it's reading the Gulag Archipelago brings all of that stuff into stark focus. You can see all of the horrible things that happened, not just to Solzhenitsyn himself, but to people that he knew, people that he cared about. It's like a deep gaze into the possible darkness, that the potential for darkness that exists inside all of us. And it's got history in it that you won't get pretty much anywhere else. There are places you can read about the things that are written in the Gulag Archipelago, but the whole thing is written in a very close in sense, and you really get a strong feeling for all of the things that are described in it. It's well written. The English translation is extremely readable, and throughout it, translations can do a lot of things in poorly or well, but in this one, you still can feel the strong sense of anger and dread at the system and the state while Solzhenitsyn was imprisoned. One thing that you learn from the Gulag Archipelago is that this is not something that can't happen to you. This is something that can happen to people, even people who are in favor of the existing regime. Solzhenitsyn was a commander of an artillery battery, and he was well decorated in World War II. And he was imprisoned because of critical statements that he made in letters to a personal friend of his. And he has stories about other people who were not even necessarily dissident, but simply, had some kind of very slight philosophical difference, and that they ended up in the same place that he did, basically. And the thing is that it also shows how a person could end up on either side of that line. Solzhenitsyn was a very contemplative person about his role in war, and he wrote about war crimes that occurred in East Germany, and one of the things that he said in one of the things in his writings is reflecting on this. He said, were we any better? And it's just, the people who were the guards weren't that different from him, honestly. And, given the right atmosphere, the right environment, that kind of atrocity is possible for anyone. You get the right series of inducements, and it's hard to tell what you could be made to do. And this book is, or rather these books, because it was published in 3 volumes originally. These books bring that into focus as well. It also breaks down fantasies that you might have about how these things might work. I mean, there's a lot in there about hypocrisy and stupidity. For instance, the prisoners in the gulags weren't permitted matches to light cigarettes or pipes or whatever, but they were very easily given blowtorches to do the work that they were being forced to do. Things like that. Even if the vast majority of the state apparatus is inefficient and plodding and slow and non-reactive or non-responsive to outside influences, there will, in any case, always be a small core of extremely sadistic people who will devise systems that will slowly, if you're lucky, and if not, quickly erode any sense of any sense of self-respect or self-esteem or even sanity that you have. The Soviet government was painfully efficient in devising methods of torture for its own people. And those methods didn't need to be devised by regular guards. They had to merely be devised by some person higher up and then propagated downward by way of orders. Originally it was written in 3 volumes, and I found out a while back that there was an abridged version, and I thought, well, why would you read an abridged version of this? It'd be like saying, well, I read War and Peace, the abridged version, right? It's actually pretty similar in length when you consider all 3 volumes. But what I found out after doing a little bit of digging is that the abridged version was actually authorized and praised by Solzhenitsyn himself before he died in 2008. So, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I just want to say a couple of things just to kind of give you examples of the kind of things that are written in it. For instance, the dedication. I dedicate this to all those who did not live to tell it, and may they please forgive me for not having seen it all, nor remembered it all, for not having divined all of it. It goes through everything from his arrest all the way through his 8 years or so in the gulags, and it's just an amazing text. The one of the lines that you may have heard, or one of the excerpts that you may have heard, is merely a footnote on page 13, where he's talking about his arrest and the impunity with which people were being arrested. And he says, "And how we burned in the camps later, thinking, what would things have been like if every security operative, when he went out at night to make an arrest, had been uncertain whether he would return alive and had to say goodbye to his family? Or if, during periods of mass arrests, as for example in Leningrad, when they arrested a quarter of the entire city, people had not simply sat there in their lairs, paling with terror at every bang of the downstairs door and at every step on the staircase, but had understood they had nothing left to lose and had boldly set up in the downstairs hall an ambush of 6 people with axes, hammers, pokers, or whatever else was at hand. After all, you knew ahead of time that those blue caps were out at night for no good purpose, and you could be sure ahead of time that you'd be cracking the skull of a cutthroat. Or what about the Black Maria sitting out there on the street with only one lonely chauffeur? Chauffeur? What if it had been driven off or its tires spiked? The organs would very quickly have suffered a shortage of officers and transport, and notwithstanding all of Stalin's thirst, the cursed machine would have ground to a halt if we didn't love freedom enough. And even more, we had no awareness of the real situation. We spent ourselves in one unrestrained outburst in 1917, and then we hurried to submit. We submitted with pleasure. Arthur Ransom describes a workers' meeting in Yaroslavl, I can't pronounce Russian, I'm sorry, in 1921. Delegates were sent to the workers from the Central Committee in Moscow to confer on the substance of the argument about trade unions. The representative of the opposition, Y. Larin, explained to the workers that their trade union must be their defense against the administration and that they possessed rights which they had won and upon which no one else had any right to infringe. The workers, however, were completely indifferent, simply not comprehending whom they still needed to be defended against, and why they still needed any rights. When the spokesman for the party line rebuked them for their laziness and for getting out of hand, and demanded sacrifices from them, overtime work without pay, reductions in food, military discipline in the factory administration, this aroused great elation and applause. We purely and simply deserved everything that happened afterward. It's, he talks about how, okay, so I've talked about breaking down the fantasies that you might have about how these things work. Let's say you're imagining these camps, sometime in the distant future, and they are, and you happen to get picked up, but the reason that you get picked up is because you're a believer in X or believer in Y, and you think that when you get there, that you'll be surrounded by other believers in X and Y, and that there will at least be some camaraderie. But one of the things that Solzhenitsyn talks about is how that's not how things were organized. It was deliberately set up such that the people who ran, that there were at least two levels of prisoners. There were the ones who were there politically, and there were the ones who were there for real crimes, theft, robbery, murder, rape, etc. And how the prison administration set up the thugs, the real criminals, as the heads of the organizations for the other prisoners, or at least as like an overseer, basically. And so things like that, you'll read so many horrifying but fascinating instances of this kind of behavior and thought and despair in these books that they're life-changing. And that's all I really have to say about the Gulag Archipelago without doing like an in-depth going through of it. But I think that first off, it would be a big project if I were to do that. And so what I will simply say at this point is that I encourage anyone who cares at all about liberty, about human liberty, and fears and hates totalitarianism, to read the Gulag Archipelago and remember it. Remember it. That's all I have to say. Thank you.